maybe you and I come down a little bit differently, but is the question of republication. So we don't
Mhm.
have to, go back and forth on that, but it is
Mhm.
important. So tell us, what is that debate about? And in particular, maybe it's died down now, but there was a lot of discussion about it in the OPC.
Mhm.
So maybe you can talk to us about why that came up, what's important about it, what the final sort of evaluation was in your own denominational context on the doctrine of republication.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting in terms of the overall origin of the debate. This is my own take: is that I think it was something of a controversial subject for a little while, and I attribute that to the fact that the larger part of the church had become unfamiliar with the particulars of the covenant of works. This is
Hmm.
not to say that you have to agree with a certain position, but just to be surprised, I think, by the conversation, I think was evidence of the fact that, yeah, this was, that we're unfamiliar with it. And, kind of anecdotal evidence of that is there are so few books devoted exclusively to the topic of the covenant of works in the last, say, since the 17th century, since the 16th century, that we're really unfamiliar with the particulars. And as I mentioned earlier, as in our discussion, when you read about the covenant of works throughout multiple treatments of it, so many theologians will relate the covenant of works to the Mosaic covenant. They will not often agree on how to do that. In the chapter that I write, there's like a dozen or more views that I kind of mention.
Yep.
So it's one of the most diverse conversations within the Reformed context. And so there was a study committee that was set up in my denomination, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, that studied it for a couple of years and produced a report that said, naturally, well, there's some views that are okay, and then there are some views that are not okay. And more or less, they came to the conclusion that any view that denies that the Mosaic covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace or a part of the covenant
Right.
of grace is probably going to be problematic in some respect. There's a lot of details to that. That's a very broad brushstroke. So on the other hand, if you say that, so long as you're saying that substantively speaking, the Mosaic covenant is a part of the covenant of grace, because in a post-fall world, all of God's dealings with human beings to save them is through the covenant of grace, then okay, we may disagree as to how exactly you're going to relate the other elements of the Mosaic covenant to the covenant of grace, but in the main, you're probably going to be on safe territory. And one of the places that I point to where this issue appears, say in the Westminster Confession, is in chapter 19, where it says that those who are united to Christ do not have the moral law as a covenant of works, thereby to be justified or condemned. Fine, perfect. But I always say, what is the opposite of that? If you are not in Christ, then that means that, and here's the weasel word, in some sense,
Right.
the moral law is a covenant of works to you because you are not in Christ, which means therefore the moral law is there for you, thereby either to be justified or to condemn you. Not to say that you could somehow fulfill the moral law, but it's the Everest, the impossible Everest that you have to climb on your own if you don't have Christ to climb it for you. And we know that in the end, you will not be able to summit that peak because of original sin and all of the actual
Right.
sin that we carry. That, I think, in a nutshell or in a thumbnail sketch, is kind of that issue as a whole.